It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome back to St Peter's College Father Michael Hill and Father Adian Cunningham, ex-members of staff, who are going to share some of their recollections of their time at St Peter's.
We're the two survivors of the Rosminians in New Zealand.
We're not ancient yet, but we are survivors.
Gentlemen, could we begin by asking you to share a little bit about your memories of coming to Gaul for the first time as a Rosminian in the 1960s?
I came to St Peter's in the beginning of 1970. In fact, we both came beginning of 1970, which was the beginning of the second year of the school. I was already a priest at that stage, and I'd been teaching for about 10 years in England as a brother and as a priest before I came. And I was a science teacher, basically, but we also ran boarding schools in England, and so I was used to boarding education, but not to co-educational education. So I arrived in 1970, and initially I think to set up the science department, because at that stage the school had just been Form 1, 2 and 3, and it was moving into having a Form 4, which is Year 10. So it would have been Year 7, 8 and 9 initially, and then moving into to 10. And the boarding school also was building up in the same way. I think they started off with 30 odd boarders the first year, 60 odd the second year, and 90 the third year, and after that we had to build St Paul's across the road to take in the seniors. But as far as I was concerned, that was my first task, was to set up the science department, building up to school certificates and so forth. And I did that for 2 or 3 years. The school grew, the numbers in the school grew, and then I was appointed deputy principal, because initially there were really just the principal, headmaster, and the senior mistress, who was Sister Mary David, as she was called then, Sister Pauline Gallagher. And she was in charge of the girls, so to speak, right from the start for 6 or 7 years, until she became the head of the mercies in the diocese. So I joined Father Herdage, the first principal, and Sister Mary David as the sort of executive group. We were 3, and so I became the deputy principal. And I don't know quite what that involved, which I wasn't doing before, but the school was growing, so the organisation, of course, was getting more and more complex. And the numbers really, it was a very successful school from that point of view. There were more kids around, of course, in those days, bigger families. And by the time I was made principal, which was after I'd been 4 years teaching here, so it would have been the end of 1973, the numbers had topped 500, and they never dropped below 530 the 6 years I was principal, and at one stage they got to 570, I think, 68, he knows exactly. So I was 6 years principal. Now, I sort of got the job early, really, because at that stage we also had the school in Takapuna, and the second principal at the school there, after a year or so, he knew that it wasn't for him.
This is Rosmini College.
At Rosmini, yes. He was a very competent, this was Father Marriott. He was an extremely competent teacher and a great community man, but he found the stress of being principal too much. And so we had to do a quick switch. And Father Herdage had to go up there and take over from him, and Father Marriott came down as head of maths and all sorts of other things he did. He was head of community eventually, and I was made principal. So the job arrived on my plate somewhat unexpectedly. We tended to follow the Marist pattern. The Marist pattern was that 6 years was the term of a principal. So after 6 years I moved on. And in fact I went back to teach at Rosmini for a bit. So that's me and St.
That's you.
Peter's, yes.
Right. I've got two Christian names, Aidan Michael Cunningham. I'm another Rosminian, of course. But when I first arrived down here in Gore, I was brother Michael. Aidan didn't exist. Brother Michael Cunningham, because Michael was my family name. Aidan was a baptismal name, if you like, but not particularly used in the family. And eventually, when Michael Hill arrived in Gore, along with brother Michael Cunningham, to distinguish the Michaels, I reverted back to Aidan. And in fact, coming down, my first visit was to Gore generally in 1966, collecting and proclaiming that the Rosminians were going to take over and run the school, which up to then, well, what do you call it? Capuchins had offered to start it. They had to pull out. So there was a lapse
school
of 2 years or so before we made the commitment in probably the early 60s to take it on.
And who made that commitment? Was that made in England?
That was made back in England.
It was made back in England, but Father Catchyside, who was the head up in Auckland, was the negotiator on the spot. And we heard about it probably about 1965. You heard about it. Brother Ted, the famous Brother Ted, who was here for many, many years on the staff, he was a founder here. He actually was teaching at Rosmini, and he came down on holiday, and he arrived in Gore, and he was put up by the parish priest, who informed him that the Rosminians were going to take over this school, and he knew nothing about it.
Sounds
It was
very Catholic.
Sub crate, yes.
It was very, very much, under wraps until eventually the decision was made.
So that was 65, and then
And then
66, at Easter holiday, Brother Ted came down proclaiming and letting people know that the school was going ahead and chasing people for money. And then in the August, 3 or 4 of us came down from Rosmini College, and that was my first introduction to the Deep South. And when I left England, I had more or less in a wardrobe, a very large heavy overcoat. But because it was winter time here, I acquired this coat, took it out of the cupboard up in Auckland, which I'd never worn, brought it down, and it came in very useful because I was billeted with Father Pat Macalise out at Wyndham, and his presbytery was freezing. I didn't think he'd had a visitor in years. And when I went into his room, or this room that he'd given me for the first night, and pulled back the bedclothes, steam just billowed forth. He had put the electric blanket on, and there was a 2 little bar fire in the corner. And I had to wrap this enormous coat that I had and sit in a chair all night and recover. I didn't dare get into the bed. Anyway, that was 66, August, collecting, going round, knocking on doors, saying, we're the Rosminians, we're going to come and take over the school, but we need money, 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 money. So it was a financial trail, visiting farms, families, and just waving the flag, really.
And in the history you've written of the school, that's very well documented. And
But
then
The fundraising had been
The
going on for
fundraising
years,
aspect.
yes.
But the other thing was that coming south, when I got on this little wee plane in Christchurch, I think it was one of the Spans aircraft still, big windows, and I was sitting next to a real cocky. Where you going, mate? I said, I'm going down to Gore to help build a school. Gore? What do you want to go there for, mate? Gore's the arsehole of hell. And so when I arrived, having flown over Gore in Invercargill and then got brought back, one of the weird things was looking down and seeing all these little funny white circles and U's all over the paddocks. And of course, it turns out they were trotting tracks, training tracks, and quite distinct from the air. So my introduction to Gore was this, Gore, what do you want to go there for, mate? And even going round, knocking on doors. Oh, it's marvellous that you're coming down here. You're going to make all the difference. You'll be making all the difference. Yeah, all these, they look over the shoulders of Protestants round the corner. Poof, oh, yeah. make some impact on them.
One of the interesting things that I sense is that when you arrived here, the community and you established a very positive relationship fairly early on. Can you tell us a little bit about how that relationship worked?
Yes, we were made very welcome. For one reason, they'd been waiting for a school for
So long.
30
Yes.
years nearly. I mean, the concept of this Catholic boys' school went back to the beginning of
48.
about 48, and they've been collecting half a crown a week in the collections.
Yes.
And people like Paul Ferris, for instance, he was he would have been destined to come here as a boy, but
Yes.
he was grown up by the
Yes.
time the school started. So the only one of his family was his youngest sister,
Yes.
who was a first day pupil. And so in a way, when we came here, there was
Everybody
mat,
opened the doors, yes.
the mat was the welcome mat was there, and that was something you were very aware of coming as we did at the end of the first year.
Yes.
We hadn't outlived our welcome by that time. We were still made very welcome, and
But the big thrill, of course, in those early days was that it was going to be a boys' school. It was always known as the Southland Catholic Boys' School,
Right.
no
Yes.
name.
and no name given to it. And the thought of being co-ed was, well,
Hello.
girls and boys together. How do you separate them apart? Well, if you want to know, we go around with a crowbar and we force them apart. You see.
Well,
All that sort of
I think
aspect.
Father Herdage was responsible because he said to Bishop Kavanagh, "What about the girls in Gore? Where do they go?" Silence, you know. But the bishop was immediately persuaded. He could see that this was obviously a very sensible thing, and Lance, Father Herdage had been deputy principal, was at the time
As he
he
came, yes.
deputy principal of a co-educational high school in Yorkshire. That's where he came from.
Okay.
So he was
had
quite happy with
experience
the
of-
concept.
he
Now,
had
is it
experience.
correct that St Peter's was the first co-educational
Yes.
Catholic school in Australasia?
I don't know about Australasia.
Secondary school. Yes and no. I mean, in New Zealand, the only other one which could even pretend to be was actually in Hokitika, where there were a few boys
Yes.
who were educated by the nuns
Yes.
because there was nowhere else to
Yes.
go, rather
Yeah.
than sending them over to
Yeah.
St Bede's. But it really wasn't a constituted co-ed school.
Right.
Whereas
And
this,
then being a boarding school as well,
Mm.
which then became a co-ed boarding
Co-ed,
school,
yes.
it actually became quite significant in terms of breaking new ground, didn't
yes,
Very much so.
it? Yeah.
Initially, there were obviously no girls boarding because the sisters, particularly the Dominicans, were quite jealous of any girls of secondary age coming here from the country and boarding in Gore to come to us, and there was a little bit of tension
I could
between
imagine that.
between
St
the schools
Catherine's and
initially.
Teshmakers were...
The Mercies didn't mind because they were involved in the
Yes,
school, but it
yes.
was, you see, the Doms had a hostel in they had Teshmakers, but they also had hostels in both Invercargill and Dunedin,
Right.
and they felt threatened by this. And I think Father Herdage said, well, we really can't say no to the girls because they're choosing to board them in Gore, and it's really nothing to do with us in one sense. But in fact, we had to take some responsibility for those girls as well.
Could I ask you each to tell us when you arrived in Gore, surprises? Biggest surprise?
My biggest surprise was having a look at the school site, because the boarding block, there was one boarding block. The initial plan, of course, had 3 boarding blocks, dormitories. There was one boarding block down the bottom of what I consider to be a scrubby hill, and this thing called the monastery, which the Capuchins had devised, on top of this hill. And there was a dusty track leading down from Coots Road, and that was it.
So
In the middle of nowhere, and some macrocarpa trees in the background, thinking, my God, Father, this is
the end of the earth, wasn't it?
this is it was the outskirts of Gore anyway.
Yes.
No houses around,
Yes, yeah.
farmland,
Yeah.
all rather peculiar, and gosh. But then across these very nice folk called the Central Committee. Gentlemen who'd been roped
Central Committee.
The Central Committee.
That's the Central Committee with the fundraising
Yes, I
group
realise that.
for the whole.
It was a
of
bit
South
leftist, I
London.
felt, wasn't
Yes,
it?
yes.
They all supported Monsignor Finlay,
Yes,
and there were some lovely stories told about the way they collected money.
I could imagine. What about Father Michael? Your biggest surprise
When I first
when
came,
when you first came to Gore?
well, this isn't really a surprise, but it's an interesting story in the sense that we were told that we were going to Southland, we were going to Gore, which was a very Presbyterian town,
Yes.
and that there would be prejudice
Yes.
against it. We were warned that this would
Yes.
happen. And when I came, there wasn't any. It just didn't exist, this so-called prejudice. You know, it was a myth. And the Presbyterians were queuing up to send their kids here, you see, but you know, there was a strict limit on the number of places. We never had more than 5 or 6%
Yes.
non-Catholic
Yes.
intake. But we found them very supportive of us, and the people in the town were very welcoming also, whether they were Catholics or not. I think they realised that St. Peter's actually brought quite a lot of other things, fringe benefits to the town. And what was interesting for me personally was to actually live in a small town, because the school I come from in England was in the middle of nowhere. And you really and it was totally a boarding school, so you hardly related to the local people at all. They do now far more, but because it's much more mixed. But in those days, it was purely a boarding school. Coming here, integrated into a small town, you became a part of the town. And one of the firsts, as you possibly know, is that Brother Ted became a councillor, and he was the first religious, I think, in New Zealand to be a borough councillor.
Okay. So what's that story about Brother Ted you were going to tell us, which encapsulates?
Oh, this was more to do with, you know, a hands-on thing, really. I mean, Brother Ted, of course, is a legend. Correct. Yes. He was the most extraordinary guy. He was a wonderful Rosminian, in the sense that he was, you know, charity, generosity, all that sort of thing. He was a rough diamond. I mean, if you met him, you'd think, goodness me, are you a monk? You know, he wasn't, there was no halo visible. But as a person, he was extraordinarily generous. And of course, the kids responded to this, and he was very much loved. That would be true, wouldn't it? He would probably be the most loved of all the Rosminians who went through, deservedly so. But when I was principal, of course, and he who had once taught me was now one of my subjects, if you like, and part of the community which I was head of, and part of the school on the staff. And so periodically I would have to ask him to do things which he didn't particularly like taking 5th form RE. He blackguarded me for making this suggestion, you see. And so anyway, but he'd always do it. And the classes were usually pitched battles, because the kids would, 5th form kids are always sceptical. They're at the most sceptical age, you see. And Ted would come out and he'd say, "Mike," he said, "they're all bloody heretics," he said. Anyway, this particular day he came up to me, he said, "We're going to have an exam, RE exam in the 5th form." I said, "Wait a minute, Ted." I said, "The school policy is that we don't have religious education exams in the school certificate year.
Yes.
We have them for the other years, but not in the 6th."
Yes.
"Oh, no. He said, "You misunderstand me." He said, "The exam isn't for the kids, it's for the parents." He said, the kids take the exam home and make the parents sit it. He said, "We've got to find out what these people believe." You see.
Yes. Yes.
But he had all the kids on his side immediately. You know,
Yes.
but this was typical of Ted.
Yes.
He always thought outside the square.
Yes.
He was totally unconventional. Well, you knew him.
Yes.
But he was extremely generous. I mean, his time was totally given to his job. but in a way which was joyful. You know, it was never burdensome for him.
Yes, his legacy as well.
If you can imagine,
Pardon?
if you can imagine for hockey.
Yes, the hockey, that's right. Tell me about the hockey, Aidan.
Well, the hockey developed. Ted didn't have a clue what it meant initially.
No. He started hockey in England.
Yes, but he didn't really know what it meant for boys and girls here. So he was able to get everything going. But in order to accompany them in weather, in middle of winter, he devised this most extraordinary, totally enclosed suit of polythene and plastic and all sorts of things.
You look like a Dalek.
It was, but it had to have some way of enabling to have a cigarette at the same time.
That's a lot. Some of the highlights, some of the challenges of coming to Gore, working in Gore, running a school, and some of those memories. Can you tell us what you remember as being some of those?
The biggest challenge? Well, the biggest challenge was getting staff, as far as I was concerned, because it was very difficult in those days when we started employing lay staff. It was difficult enough finding enough money to pay for them because the fees were very small. I can tell you a story about the Hickey family in a moment, which they particularly encapsulate. The fees, I think, were $55 a term was the top fee for Form 6 and 7. Then it went down to 45, 35. The third and fourth child were $15 a term. They were always, youngsters, of course. The fifth and sixth, that's the third and fourth child, the fifth and sixth child were $5 a term. And Mr. and Mrs. Hickey arrived with 7 children in school at once. And I said to Brian, I said, you're off the scale. We have to pay you for the privilege of having this number 7. I don't know who number 7 was, but you can work that out. And I remember somebody leaving us in the middle of the year, head of science, a very competent lady, but there was a family problem cropped up. She just had to find somebody for the third term, a science teacher, competent person. And this was a tremendous headache, But there was a guy called Chris Lallis who had taught here earlier, and he'd gone back. He's still actually in the biology department at the university in Otago. He rang me up late during the holidays. He said, "I hear you're in a fix." He said, Would you like me to come back for a term? I said, "Chris, you'd save my life." And he did, So the Lord looked after us, in fact.
Yes.
Miraculous intervention, almost. Yeah. Now, biggest challenge, I just can't think of one particularly, except that I enjoyed trying to break in the school grounds.
Yes, because that was something I was going to ask you about. You have a reputation for planting trees.
Well, trees and generally landscaping and trying to develop the place, along with Eric Willett. And also rodding drains along with Father Buckner. That was a bit of a challenge.
We had a tremendous support there from the local
Ian
reserves.
Gilchrist.
A chap called Ian Gilchrist was in charge, and he said, "You provide the land, we'll provide the trees."
Yes.
He charged us nothing for any of the planting, and he would also send people to prune and to maintain.
Yes.
He said, I said to him once, don't we? No, he said, you're providing the land. He said, you're beautifying the town by what you're doing.
And that same would apply to Newman's nurseries. The old man was always prepared to lend a hand and give some advice.
And I remember talking to some a couple of guys in Chicago, principals, about this business, and they said, we'd never get anything like that sort of cooperation in the city that you get in the small town. Well, I said that's the way small towns seem to operate anyway, but they were very generous to us.
Could I ask you about integration? Because you were principal leading up, or headmaster as it was called in those days, leading up to the time of integration. How involved were you in those negotiations?
Personally, not really, no. I had a bearing in one or two situations. Actually, I was responsible for one word in the Integration Act or one statistic, if you like. We heard about it. I mean, I used to go to principals' meetings and it was talked about.
Yes.
And in a way, the decisions were all made at the top level
Yes.
by the bishops.
Yes.
And they appointed these negotiators, and they appointed Father Catchside as one of the negotiators. When he retired from Rosmini College in Auckland, he went into the education office in Auckland for a couple of years, and then the integration stuff started. And he, because of he had huge experience really, and he was a very shrewd person, very good negotiator. He was a great behind-the-scenes negotiator. So he became one of the key negotiators with a chap called Pat Holt, who you may remember, who was an ex-primary school, Catholic primary school teacher, but he'd been a government inspector for many years, and these were the two chief people. One particular time I was in Wellington for some reason, on school business, and Father Philip Catchside said to me, there's a select committee meeting tomorrow which we're going to. Would you like to come? Well, I said, really not. Well, he said, no, he said, they're open meetings, you know, the public can come, so you're welcome to come. So I came and sat at the back, and there were these 6 members of Parliament sitting around the table, and the negotiators out here, the four Catholic negotiators, and then there were a couple of representatives from the teachers' unions, and then at the back there was anybody you liked who could come off the street. And I got this note passed back to me by Philip during this thing. He said, and it just said, "How many non-Catholics have you got at St. Peter's?" Well, it's not a statistic I ever actually used, so I had to spend about 5 minutes going through, you know. So I put back and I said, about between 25 and 30, about 5%. So in the conversation, they offered this figure of 5%, you see. And that's what went into the Act.
And that's what went into the
That's
Act.
what went
Integration
into the
Act,
Act.
5%
Yes,
non-pref.
Yes, that was it was a figure which the teachers' unions couldn't make up their mind whether they wanted access or not to the schools. You see, they didn't want the schools to be too big, but they didn't want them poaching kids from other schools, and yet they didn't want the schools to be exclusive. So they accepted 5% as a very reasonable compromise. So it turned out to be quite a good thing. The other thing was at integration. This was how to get the school integrated as a Form 1 to 7 school.
Yes.
And that caused quite a lot of problems. And I had
particularly locally.
Yes.
Oh yes, that's right.
With Mr. Bunn.
With Mr. Famous, the
Stuart
notorious
Bunn.
Mr. Bunn. Yes. Who was a pain in the neck, to put it mildly. Yes, he was the one person. I mean, the guy at the high school, your one-time employer.
Yes.
What was his name?
Doug Olson.
Doug Olson.
Doug was quite different. Doug publicly objected to any private school getting funds which should go to the state school. But personally, privately, he could not have been more cooperative. And he'd sometimes wander across the paddock, knock on the door, come in and chat with me, and we'd talk about, he said, I've got a kid who's not happy, would you think of taking it for this reason, you know? And so there was a lot of that sort of personal relationship on a very, very amicable basis, and we'd have joint staff dues and things like that. So that aspect was good.
What would you like your legacy as Rosminians to be? How would you like to be remembered in terms of the Rosminian legacy or your personal legacy at St. Peter's?
Well, it's a Catholic school and it's got a Catholic ethos, and that's always had that.
Yes.
And I would like to think that is totally maintained.
Yes.
And the Rosminian ideal, which is very much involved with friendship and love and mutual support and respect, are values which I'm sure have continued in the school, and I think they're the sort of things that I think incarnate the Rosminian spirit.
So in other words, you would encourage the leadership of the school to maintain the commitment to those ideals and that ethos.
Yes.
And the school motto itself.
Yes.
And the school
Quite
motto.
clear.
I mean, it's a wonderful school motto. It really is. I mean, you couldn't get a better school motto in my view.
And the other aspect, of course, is centred on the chapel,
Yes.
which was
Yes.
Father Hill's initiative.
Yes.
and a great one too, because in the early days, when we met as a community, we had the bottom classroom in the 3-storey block, the big one, as a temporary sort of chapel. But in the very early days, we even used the bottom part of the boarders' dormitory, and then later the crush hall, to gather the community, or to gather the school community for Mass and celebrate, particularly on Sunday, and eventually ended up down in church, walking down on a Sunday morning. But later, when the chapel came, it was all on site.
We ran out of room for classrooms round about 1977, I suppose, and this end room in the ground floor, it was A5. I don't know how
It's still called A5.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And it was a bigger room, and we had a tabernacle and all sorts of everything there. It was the school chapel, but we needed to use it as a classroom, you see, so this was a problem. So I remember trotting up to Christchurch for equipment, and I said to the guy there, "We've got a problem." And he listened very carefully. He said, "Well, you can't use the word chapel, and you can't use the word anything to do with religion." He said, "But how about if we provided these chairs which are suitable for your flexible audiovisual room?" So he gave it another name, and he gave us these
This is from the department.
these chairs which were not desks.
Yes.
They had a thing you could write on, you know,
Yes.
writing.
Lecture things.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you could pick them up and turn around
Yes.
through 90 degrees. So the money ran out before the chapel was built. That was what happened.
Yes.
They had so much money.
Yes.
They built the boarding block. They
Yes.
built accommodation
Yes.
for the priests,
Yes.
and they built the school block,
Yes.
and they built the specialist block, which was the laboratories effectively, and that was it when we first started. And then we raised the money to provide a
Workshop,
the workshop and
home economics
home,
block.
home,
Yes.
home economics room. It was nothing really. It was just a room to start with, and technical drawing room. So there were 3 spaces built there, and that was it. You know, we had no other specialist facilities, and of course we had no chapel. So the year, I think it was 1977 at Christmas, Tony Kearney, who was head of the board, chairman of the board, and also our accountant, said to me, "What about a chapel?" I said, "Well, what about it, Tony?" He said, "This year coming up will be the farmers of Southland will have so much money they won't know what to do with it." He said, "If we don't go now, we will never be able to do it," because everything was, you know, the prices were up, everything was good. The lambing had been superb. It was the year of the rich year. So I went to see Bishop Kavanagh and I said, "Can we launch an appeal onto well?" He said, "You know, there's still." I said, "Well, it's going to be an extra, but will it have your blessing?" He said, "It will have my blessing." And he said, "Whatever you build, make it worthy." So he gave us permission to do something special, you know, not just to produce a concrete cubic blockhouse, which is what was originally designed, you know. So we produced something which was quite imaginative.
It did, because it goes back to that early Christian concept of community, doesn't it? Yeah. very much
Yes.
so.
And you know where the concept came from? The local draftsman was working on a centrifuge pump for the sewage system. And that's where
The spiral.
the shape comes from, when you look at it.
Hopes for the future? Any particular hopes that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, the Rosminian vocation isn't exclusively a teaching vocation. Rosmini's idea was that his priests and brothers, and also sisters, because there's a Rosminian order of nuns as well, they respond to the needs in charity, whatever it happens to be. So we're sort of, we're like the pioneer corps in the army. We do any dirty jobs that come along, the Rosminians get them. Not quite. But I mean, if the need is for education, that's what we were into. And the nuns, actually, they became specialists in rural education.
Yes.
And that was their original speciality for many, many years.
Yes.
But right from the beginning, we had a variety of apostolates. We always had parishes, we've always had
Yes.
schools, and we've always had spirituality centres and that
Yes.
sort of thing.
Yes.
Preaching, missioning, that's the type of apostolates, which has meant that both of us have had varied apostolates. Once we finished teaching, we went on to other things. I've had 4 different, really, careers as a Rosminian in New Zealand. I was a teacher, obviously. I became an adult educator for about 8 years. I went around the country with adult groups with the Walk by Faith course, which was very interesting. I had a short time in the retreat house at Rosary House in Christchurch, giving retreats and missions and things for a period of about 2 years. And then we came down to Dunedin because of community reasons. We decided we would close up in Christchurch and just concentrate on the 2 dioceses where we'd started, that's Auckland and Dunedin. And Bishop Boyle said to me one day, he said, do you know what you're going to do when you go down? I said, I have no idea, I'm at your disposal. He said, I want you to be editor of the New Zealand Tablet. Well, I'd never ever had any aspirations to be the editor of a magazine, but that was what I did for the next 16 years. Not the tablet. We had, we moved on to the other, to Tuimotu, yes.
Yeah.
So the last 16 years of my employment was that, and now I'm retired, so I do whatever comes along.
And retired, but he's just retired also as being editor.
Yes.
And author and biographer.
Yes. I understand that.
Antonio Rosmini.
And Father Aidan, you better tell us what you've been doing since
After
you
I
left
retired
St.
from teaching,
Peter's.
moving away at the end of '94, in theory, I should have been working in adult education with a bishop, Bishop Len. But I had part of a sabbatical in '95, and then came back in '96, working at Mosgiel and assisting in the seminary as a formator. And then when the seminary closed in '97, Father Superior, Father General in Rome, rang me up, and he was an Irishman, and he said, "We think you're just a man to go to India to look after the novices. What do you think?" And I said, "I think it's a bloody stupid idea. But I suppose you want me to go?" And say yes. "That's right!" And the phone was put down. I couldn't get back for 48 hours.
Hence we ended up in India.
So I ended up in India, on and off, and then came back and eventually became parish priest in North East Valley. So I'm now parish priest, Sacred Heart Church, North East Valley, and every now and then summoned to or willingly come down to St. Peter's to see how things are going.
Okay, well that's it.
That's it.
Unless you got anything you wanted to ask us. Which
No, John's covered all the
All the key things, eh?
sides of it.